Well, hello and welcome, dear audience. Welcome to our CRM Convo number 186, the second CRM Convo we have in 2024. Nearly a fresh year to go for, and we have, with a very exciting approach for you and us, prepared for today. We would like to continue a debate and discussion we started with our experts and you. When we started the dialogue with our two experts in autumn, the topic landscape was already well advanced, generative AI, but also a number of implementations and beneficial products were coming up were already on the market, and the process of being implemented and looking through them and seeing how they work out and how they deliver a benefit was a very interesting topic. So were the challenges. There were so many points we could not mention, like you could say in a good thriller. It literally demanded a sequel. So in 2023, generative AI reached its high peak, leaving us to ask the experts whether 2024 will bring disappointment or progress or even more doomsday fear. That saying, there was just today published from the ECO Association, which is the combined organization of internet, commerce, and some more trends in Germany. The poll published about what is the key driver in 2024. And guess what? You are right at this screen where you are. It will be generative AI. The Game of Thrones between ethics and commercialization, coupled with new EU regulations, US executive orders, and New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI, sparks a debate about the governance of AI. Will open source triumph or proprietary models? When we move beyond obvious use cases, the true value of AI emerges. But what is it? Is the time for analysts to keep vendors grounded to avoid the risk of losing them to the clouds or cuckoo-clouded fantasy? But how does this all look in the light of the experts? We are very happy and grateful that we were able to win Dr. Michael Wu and Jon Reed, despite their busy schedules, to look at the issues and perspective with you and us. Welcome, Dr. Michael Wu and Jon Reed, here with us, and I would be delighted if you would introduce yourself to the audience, starting with Michael, please. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Sure. I'm Dr. Michael Wu. I'm the Chief AI Strategist at PROS. I think I've been here a few times, so I don't want to take more time to introduce myself.
A bit.
Hello, I'm Jon Reed, co-founder of Diginomica, and always great to be with you all, and I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion today, and it's always a treat to have some back and forth with Michael on this.
Likewise.
Well, we invite the audience to participate.
Let's dig in.
No pressure, but I expect to learn something this hour. So,
that bar is
just
high.
so you know.
That bar is high now. 2023. As Ralph just said, we had hype with a capital H, I think. Probably also with a capital Y. So Gartner put generative AI smack on the top. What will this year bring? Also looking when we are talking more and more about regulation and guardrails of the whole technology. And
I think the regulation would definitely continue to progress. I think one of the themes that I mentioned, I don't think it was at this show. I mean, maybe in another show. I think it was with Paul and Greenberg and Brent. That next year, that back then, like I said, which is 2024, will be the year where regulation would be big. It will play a huge role in AI and these type of technology, whether it's generative AI or other type of AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fascinating thing for me kind of rejoining this conversation is how many pretty important stories have happened since our last time. And I last time I presented a bunch of things where got Dr. Wu's comments on solvable and unsolvable problems, and we had some really good discussion about that. And one of my things is like, I think sometimes it's surprising sometimes what is solvable in an enterprise context versus what is not. And it's so important to have these honest discussions where we can break through the noise on this, because, for example, last time I brought up that I think data privacy is a solvable problem in an enterprise context, whereas people freak out about that in the commercial realm. But one of the things I would say, one of the biggest changes is the EU AI Act is actually, quote unquote, official. It doesn't go into effect for a couple of years, but it impacts the discussion because it gives us some idea of how this might impact vendors. And then the other thing that's really been brewing lately that I think is really, really important is just how difficult has been for these large language models to have curated training sets that are devoid of controversy. The copyright stuff, I've changed my stance on a little bit, because some of the most recent stuff, and it's not just text, is coming out verbatim from these prompts. And part of the problem is that depending on how you query these systems, if you're good at querying them, you can get them to spit out and kind of reveal themselves, I guess you could say. And it's going to be very, very difficult for these systems to deal with that, except, on an enterprise context, you can approach it differently. And so this is one of the really big discussions for today is enterprises can approach this in a totally different way. For example, like Bloomberg, they built their own proprietary, finance LLM, and they avoid these problems because they know exactly what is in their training data. Yeah. So they're not compromised. And so I think what you're going to see this year, which is really interesting, is 3 different categories of customers. There's going to be some that just sit on the fence because they're afraid of all these risks, and I think that would be a mistake. Then there's going to be customers that go ahead and do what I call the AI overreach, which is to extend AI beyond what it's capable of and get themselves into trouble. And then there's going to be customers, and hopefully the ones listening to this show, that take the third path, which is sensible ways forward that pay off for them and build momentum and trust for AI internally. And so I hope during this discussion today we can get some clarity on these 3 groups and where you want to be within them.
Maybe the other 2 groups should join in as well in order to get led into the right path. So, but getting a little forward from regulations and the like. So what we see is that there are obstacles and opportunities. So what are the main obstacles that you see right now for, in particular, the 2 groups that John just mentioned?
Yeah, I think the obstacle would be the fact that a lot of these laws and regulation aren't, I would say, completely kind of flush out and kind of there's rulings are not like kind of very definite. Like, for example, is generative AI generated content, are those copyrightable or not? Like how much I say, if it's generated without kind of a stroke of genius, then you can't, right? You can't copyright it. But what does that mean? What is the stroke of genius? Like what? I mean, how much I would say novelty or that you have to introduce for that to be to contribute something new, right? I mean, I think very often it is the case that there's very little things that are brand new under the sun, right? We all have an education. We all learn from people around us. So we all influenced by the knowledge that's imparted on us. So when we create something, we don't create them out of vacuum, out of, we are always influenced by, something, right? And that, so can we say that, like all human creativity is just, mostly plagiarism anyway? There's only a little bit of a novelty, right? But But hey, that novelty is sometimes sufficient to give you the credit for creating that novel thing, the little bit of novelty, right? But why is it okay for a human to do that and not okay for an AI to do that? I mean,
well, actually, no, it's not okay for a human to do that. There's very specific rules around copyright and fair use. And I was more on your side before, but with all the examples we're seeing, both of like visual logos that are coming out exactly like the brand looks, and also when you have a long, exact verbatim article from the New York Times appearing, that's beyond fair use. That's actually verbatim copy, and that actually copyright law governs that. Humans can't do that. And you see that all in court all the time, where if music is exactly the same, these music creators will come to a financial terms, and these models are going to have to basically license this content if they can't disguise it enough if they can disguise it so that it doesn't come out verbatim. That's a different story. But if it's coming out verbatim like this, they're gonna have to license it. And in fact, OpenAI has been doing just that. They've been having licensing conversations with a bunch of different content providers for this reason. And so I think just be honest and do the right thing. You're $30 billion, whatever, how much you're worth right now. Like license the content if it's going to come out verbatim. If it's not going to come out verbatim, then I think your point is valid in the sense that on some level these systems, like if they're just going to generate like new content that's sourced from different things, that's a little bit different. I mean, you still have to have a conversation about compensating creators. The other thing I wanted to point out is that it's not just copyrighted content. There's objectionable content in there too. And I know we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about child pornography today, but there's been some really important studies done on some very, very disturbing kinds of images that can be generated from these systems. And again, it's all a matter of how you prompt these systems, and these are kind of big eye-opening discoveries. And in fact, Stable Diffusion had to cut off some of its main data sources, and there's a whole bunch of ongoing controversy right now around these topics. And to Dr. Wu's point, these haven't been resolved yet, and so this is going to scare a lot of customers into saying, well, I need to sit on the sidelines until some of this stuff gets a little bit clearer. And I would actually say, no, don't sit on the sidelines, but start looking at what else you can do with these models that protect you from some of these problems. And there are some really good answers to that we can get into, and I'm sure Michael has some thoughts on this also, in terms of there's some much more focused use cases that can allow you to avoid generating this type of questionable content. And also there's all kinds of build your own options, and we can get in maybe a little more to what options are available to customers now. But I would say don't sit on the sidelines, but also it's important to be aware of these issues.
Yeah,
Talking
totally. Yeah.
Talking about the sidelines, there recently have been a bunch. If you're looking into LinkedIn and personal discussions that I had with a couple of people, so there are two groups relating to when it comes to IP or usage of IP. Ones are blatantly saying, or that's the one strong campus that they're saying, hey, the likes of NYT, they simply need to change their business model. So they are getting disrupted by technology. So they are legacy and they need to adapt or die. This is the strong wording of that camp. The other camp is basically what John just related to. There is IP law. So means those companies that do train and do use that, well, do train their systems, better adhere to it. Is the question that I have, is there a third way?
Well, the debates, the LinkedIn debate's kind of irrelevant because the courts need to decide this, and until the courts decide this, it doesn't matter what some blowhard on LinkedIn thinks. And I've read some really blowhard opinions about this, and you know, I have pretty strong feelings about this because I don't see why this is a different licensing issue than any other kind of licensing you would do. But let the courts decide, and I think there's plenty of room for these systems to have both, to respect the training sources, but also to respect the fact that they're creating something new. I think there's room for both, but the courts have to decide. I mean, the point though is that there's all kinds of ways to have a more focused approach, and one of the principles that I have been wrapping my head around, and I'd be curious to get Michael's perspective on this, but kind of on a more like positive tone for enterprise AI in this year, is that one of the things that I'm seeing is, yes, AI does expose your data quality and data readiness, because most of these good enterprise examples do involve some of your own data being infused into the model in some way. It's not, it's generally, you're not just going to be able to use an external model without some of your own data in some capacity being involved. But the good news is you can start in a focused way. And so as long as you have some quality data in some area of your operation, that's a promising place to get started. I did one of my first real generative AI use cases late last year, and it was a insurance company, was a customer facing bot, but what they had really, really good help documentation around how their customers, access certain policy information, and what the LLM could do that hadn't been able to be done before. Like the old bots of the old days could send you a link to an article, but the new LLM bot could kind of compile the different information from different sources in a much more intuitive way. But the architecture is very, very rigorous, and so the vendor in question showed me the architecture, and they were able to source for the customer multiple large language models, which each have different strengths. So the customer doesn't have to worry about that. The customer doesn't have to assume the liability of that, but the customer also gets these focus results based on their data. And the way I see it, this is powerful because AI ultimately requires trust. And the way you build that trust is through successful projects and building that momentum. And so I think the really cool part of this, and I'd be curious to get Michael's perspective, is you don't have to boil the ocean and get your entire data governance organized across every department and the master data headaches that have plagued you for years. Just pick one area where you have quality data and a need and an obvious use case, and move ahead. And for this customer, they were able to dramatically reduce their email support. They're able to offer that 24/7 kind of somewhat intelligent support that before was dependent on human agents. So anyway, I'd be curious to see what Michael thinks about that. But I think that's the promising way forward for enterprise AI right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's definitely the case that, I think that so there's let me just clarify a little bit when you say infusing your data into this AI, right? There's retraining the AI, right? Which typically is not advisable because that's just plain too expensive,
Right.
so you could, I think OpenAI, spent I think $60+ million just on the hardware, just to buy, enough NVIDIA, these cards and the graphics cards to train these large language model, right? And so the other way to kind of infuse your data in there is essentially to use this approach that is commonly known as RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation, right? So you're not actually telling your generative AI to come up with the answer, on its own, right? You basically give it some guide. You say okay, we know that what's the strength of generative AI? The strength of generative AI is that it knows language. It's a language model, right? So it knows all the language of the world, and it can read. It could have some levels of understanding and so on, right? So it's almost like having a really smart kid that's a language genius, right? And he doesn't actually have any domain specific knowledge about your business or anything, right? But you can read everything and read really fast, right? So why not, if you have such a person on your team, in your company, right? How would you use them, right? You could say, instead, to prevent it from coming up with random stuff, right? Which is sometimes we call hallucination, right? You give it a little guideline. You say, okay, now if someone asks you a question, right? Don't just answer it, right? The technology will basically go to your knowledge base to do a search first, right? To surface all the relevant articles that could potentially answer that question. And then you just read all those articles and then summarize it, in such a way to answer the user's question, right? So now that's a very different thing. The prompt would be completely different. The prompt would be read these articles first, synthesize, whatever, and give reference or whatever. Your prompt would be completely different than just, answer this question, right? So that's prompt engineering as in essence, right? So I think this is typically the most common way that company can kind of infuse their data into these language model, right? So in a way, like you're not actually retraining it. You simply kind of augmenting it with search, right? With data that can be surfaced through search engine or something or some other mechanism. Yeah.
Right. And it gets even more promising when you look at the amount of industry-specific large language models that are being developed by vendors, so that, to your point, maybe they do have some domain knowledge, because maybe you're infusing your RAG-based customer data with an industry-specific knowledge house, kind of like Bloomberg built with Bloomberg GPT, that gives you that. So now you're drawing specifically on data for your industry. And so it would be a real shame if companies sat on the sidelines waiting for lawsuits and regulations to get resolved when there are these clear opportunities to move forward. And to your point, like in the case of this use case that I investigated, it was an interesting one, because I asked the vendor, don't join me on the call because I'm going to ask your customer if this system hallucinates, and I want to get an honest answer from them about that. And they sucked it up and they let me do that, and I had very honest conversations, and I also used the bot myself. And the significant thing to point out is this is, like, a lot of companies are starting with internal use cases to get more comfortable, but this is actually a customer-facing bot in a regulated industry. So the stakes are pretty high for them. And I could not get the bot to spit out any controversial information whatsoever. It was very, very clear about what, if it didn't have the right answer, it would tell you. So it was very careful not to just, take that notorious kind of stab that some of these, consumer systems thing. And to Dr. Wu's point, it is a little bit like having a very informed, service worker, and yet, it doesn't replace the senior problem resolution specialist. But what I thought was really interesting in this case is that this company, their service people are also salespeople, which is sort of a nice blurring of the lines. I think we're going to see a lot more of in the future with these systems, where if you can handle all the routine stuff, then maybe your service people can work more on things like upselling, which is a real solid business benefit, not just reducing call volume, but actually having a business benefit around customer interaction, right? And so it's cool to see that it's possible. Now, I was able to, one of the things you would see in a more focused system like this is it's not as sexy as just playing around with a chat GPT, because one of the fun things about a system like that is you can ask it anything and have fun with it, and it says crazy stuff sometimes, and you can ask it to give you a sonnet, turn my white paper into a sonnet in the form of Shakespearean literature or whatever. Like, you can't do that with this kind of bot. You have to like narrow your expectations a little bit, but it's still a good interactive experience that's much, much better than the so-called dumb bots of old. So
now, we had touched on the topic of intellectual property before, and before we get too far away from it, I'm curious. AI gets used in a patent form by big pharma. Pharmaceutical companies run problems through artificial intelligence engines and come up with new drugs, which they are then able to patent. Is there a lesson to be learned for large language models from that? I mean, it's not language based, obviously, but is there something either legislatively or procedurally that can be learned from that?
Well, I mean, like I said, the law here is actually not super precise yet. I mean, so if it's completely generated by, I would say some kind of generative AI, right? It wouldn't be a large language model. It would be some kind of molecular generative AI, right? So it's and you just patent it, then I don't think you're going to fly. I don't think it's going to fly right now. I think you have to probably go test it, characterize the pharmacokinetic, the drug metabolism, and all this other stuff, right? To make sure that it is doing what it's supposed to do before you could actually get some kind of patent on it. I don't think it's, I think, to me, if it's something come directly out of a generative AI, that's the same thing as, like that, I think artist, I think her name is Chris. She used, Midjourney to create this graphic kind of comic journal or something like that. And she tried to copyright it, and then the court says you can't, because you don't know how that's generated. You could copyright all the prompt that you wrote, because you wrote those, right? But these images are created by Midjourney, which you have no idea how it's creating it. That you cannot copyright, right? So I think there's a little bit of kind of, I would say, like, coming back to that stroke of genius, right? How much work is needed to be in there, right? I think definitely I agree with John that, like, if you're coming up, entire article or verbatim, right, then that's definitely some issue. But I do think that there is also I would say that seems like in machine learning what we call overfitting problem, because you are basically training it with your model is so flexible. Basically, you could simply memorize all the possibilities out there. It's not generalizing. It's not actually generating it. So it's actually it's memorizing it by kind of brute force.
Sure, but if it was an easily solvable problem, then OpenAI wouldn't be negotiating licenses with content creators. They would be solving the problem technically if they could, because they'd rather not pay those license fees. But Marshall, to your point, I do think that the definition of creativity and copyright is going to evolve over a period of time, because, like, so for example, there was a controversy with an artist that won a competition using some of these tools, but when you dug into it, what I found out is he spent 70 hours manipulating images. And so at some point, it's like, well, who are you giving credit for here? And this is one of the things that actually frustrates me right now, is that part of the skill of using these systems is actually asking the right questions and getting the right content out of those systems. It's not so the humans are still being pretty creative, and so I think over time I'd like to think that we can have laws that encompass that, and that give credit where creative acts are being supported by technology, because that happens all the time, right? Like a lot of musical instruments require technology. That the impact of technology on music, for example, goes back a long way now. So why wouldn't this be considered? When we get to the point where machines are creating their own viable creative work on their own, we have a different set of problems. But this generation of machines is not capable of doing that. But that doesn't mean that it can't surprise you sometimes with some pretty cool things. I'm not saying that. It's just that, people aren't tuning in to see like full AI generated stuff, except as a novelty. It's not ready yet for that, but someday we'll need that. And my big concern is more that I think creating smart regulations is difficult, and I think it requires a lot of literacy to understand where all this is headed. And this kind of brings us back to the open source topic a little bit, because one of the concerns with the EU AI Act is that it appears that it's going to be difficult for a lot of open source providers to meet some of the conditions of the act as currently specified. And that's a real concern to me, because I think one of the biggest concerns around AI is that the current generation of AI requires very large data sets to do what they do, and to train these big models. And that puts power in the hands of a small number of providers that can afford that process that Dr. Wu referred to around what OpenAI did. And if you make it hard for open source vendors and models to fulfill regulatory requirements, now you're limiting customer choice, you're limiting the amount of companies involved in this, and I think that's very, very detrimental. So I hope that regulations can incorporate a little more of that. One of my colleagues, Neil Radin on Diginomica, wrote about this a little bit, and what he said was he talked about the EU AI Act's one-size-fits-all approach, demanding extensive control over development, posing impractical barriers for open source AI, obligations like risk mitigation, data governance, and prolonged documentation, which are challenging for decentralized open source projects. And these complex requirements may be difficult for open source providers. So this is an example of where these regulations need to, I think, be thoughtful about this. And Neil proposed some solutions around exempting AI open source AI from some of those regulations unless there's a high risk scenario that needs to be considered. I could see another one where you have to, where you're bound by regulations once you reach a certain level of productive usage, rather than like just me or one of us tooling around on our own with a system. So I think that kind of thing can be sorted out, but these are real serious concerns that haven't been resolved. And that's one reason why I will make the argument that this year I think most companies are not going to choose open source versus proprietary. I think that's a little bit of a false framing. I think a better framing right now is that a lot of companies are going to go through software vendors like Pros and like many others who are going to help them get started without having to contend with this landscape that right now is very confusing. Now, some deep-pocketed companies may charge ahead, build their own models and stuff like that, but I think a lot of companies are going to look to vendors right now to smooth the way for them on projects.
Yeah.
Michael.
No, I think I just want to say, like, I think previously you mentioned that there are domain-specific language models, right? I mean, there's Medtronics, there's, the medical one. I think there's an aviation one that's recently created. So I think these are, it still doesn't cover the specificity of your data, right? I think that it, training these model with a domain knowledge simply means that you understand your jargon. Right? Rather than just understanding like English, or French or Spanish in general, is trained with enough, I would say, like, say if it's medical, right, or some chemical, right? I mean, some of these chemical names are like, horrific. If you even like name them, if you remember your organic chemistry, it's like they're horrific. Like to when people say something, an organic chemist will understand exactly what they're talking about, but to other people they will be like, just like, what are you talking about? This is like a completely different language, right? But having trained this domain specific LLM simply means that it has a general knowledge within that domain, right? It's never going to get as specific as your data. So it's still, even if you have say an aviation specific language model, you still need to try to use as much of your data as possible, right? To ground it is what I call grounding, right? So grounding is this process of ensuring that when the data is sparse, when it actually doesn't know the answer to, it doesn't actually hallucinate and come up with things that doesn't make sense.
Right, and to your point, Michael, I think the implications are that very few companies are ready to take that on, right? To take on the architectural challenge of selecting that model and infusing that with their data via RAG or other techniques, and perhaps even some reinforcement learning in some cases, or some guardrails they might want. That's why I think the role of software vendors in enterprise AI in 2023 is very important to get more projects off the ground, because some companies may have the sophistication to do this, but I think most of them don't.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that, actually not just software vendor. I think some of the consulting, firms are actually, create a practice around, helping company implement these. For example, I know, like, there are companies that actually just go out and help people implement this retrieval augmented generation kind of framework. Just that. You have a search engine, and you have LLM, and how I'm just gonna, you have a data source, and I'm gonna just hook them up so that it works to solve your problem. So.
With all the challenges and options that you just listed, John, so what should businesses that want to implement an AI system, just in quotes, so what should they look out for, be cautious of, and use as opportunities versus their own guardrails when deciding?
Well, do we need to narrow down that AI being used for a particular purpose? I'm just saying a company implementing AI, that covers a very, very broad
Okay,
space.
let's say Gen AI. That's limited there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean,
Well, Gen AI is actually very generic as well, right?
Still very broad, yeah.
You can use
for sure.
Gen AI for writing a blog, responding to email, responding to support question. You could do
I'm aware it's kind of an MBA for, yeah.
So generally, I always want customers to start by taking a broader framework around their transformation strategy and the core business problems they're trying to address, their core pain points and opportunities, and to take that perspective first. I don't like the perspective of like, how can we use AI? I like the perspective of what problems are we trying to solve, and then to what extent will the various flavors of AI help us? Because in many cases, you may find that generative AI isn't mature enough for your scenario, and that there's other forms of AI that are more mature and are going to be more effective for you, or not. But so I think you have to start there. But the other thing that I said, a big clue, is where your data quality resides, because to Michael's point, your own data is going to be really important to the caliber of the results that you get. And so data quality is a really, really important consideration to guide your next step. I can't tell you how many customers I heard from this year who struggled on AI projects. And when I dug deeper, it was because they put crappy data into the system out of curiosity to see what it would spit out. And lo and behold, it spit out crap. And you know, that's the whole AI overreach thing in one scenario. Another example of AI overreach is trying to use it for headcount reduction and trying to have it do too much. You need to figure out exactly what it's good at. But one thing that may surprise people is, I think that when I talk about solvable and unsolvable problems, I think that accuracy to some extent is actually a solvable problem in two different ways. One is the techniques that Michael described do generate a much more accurate result. I mean, we just published a case study on Diginomica about a legal vendor providing AI help with documentation automation on legal documents, and the customer found a 98% accuracy rate and said, well, this is pretty similar to what we're getting from humans for some of this kinds of things. But in other AI scenarios, you don't even need a 98% accuracy rate. This is the thing around thinking through these scenarios. For example, if you're using AI for certain kinds of predictive scenarios, in many cases, the threshold is much lower than 98% in order to have like an improvement on your current situation. So the 2 points I would make about accuracy are, if you use the techniques that Dr. Wu described, you will get a more accurate result. And second, sometimes you don't need perfect accuracy to have a good use case. It really, really depends on the situation. And this is why human-in-the-loop design is so important, because if you design these processes properly, the humans can catch some of the problems when you do have that issue. But on the other hand, you know, if you're talking, and this is why the autonomous vehicles thing has struggled so much, is because autonomous vehicles in open roads, the accuracy rate is quite high, and the outlier cost is very huge, because that's the other component, is what is the cost when things go wrong. Sometimes the cost if you show someone the wrong ad, there's really very little problem there. But if you show your car takes the wrong turn on the highway and heads into a bridge or a ditch, then that's a huge different story as far as outliers are concerned.
I am obliged to jump in for getting my comment towards the two experts in the way of, to make it a bit more safe. What do you think on proper training and enabling the potential users of the to be implemented AI?
Well, I think there's no magic bullet here. As John said, right, these generative AI is not going to replace human experts. In fact, in many of the cases, I would say, like, these generative AI, their primary mechanism to value is productivity gain, right? You could do a lot more in a lot less time, you can do, it used to take you like, an hour to write a blog. Now it takes you like 5 minutes or something like that. So you could do a lot more, and so you get a lot more productivity. But keep in mind that if that's the main mechanism of value, right, it doesn't really need to be perfectly accurate either, right? I mean, I think a lot of times, people are saying that, well, I mean, the AI is not as good as my human. Why am I using it? Like, hey, it's not, you should still use it, even though it's not as good as human, because it can work 24/7, and your humans can't do that, right? So the productivity gain is a valid enough, I would say, mechanism for company to adopt these type of AI, right? And I think that's in a lot of cases, the human experts they are the guardrail, right? They are the guardrail. So they essentially they have to look at the result. I mean, I think we discussed, using prompt engineering in place of data scientists, right? It's just not there yet. I mean, you need a data scientist to really understand whether the code is actually writing. It doesn't make any sense. Does it actually do what you do? It will, if you ask it to write some code that does this, it will write some code that does this. But it will give you some code, but you will have no idea whether it's actually really doing what you want, right? And you crunch out some number, and you actually don't know if it's right, don't know if it's wrong. You still need a data scientist to check it, right? So it's in a lot of the time, I would say the human experts themselves are the guardrail. So yeah.
Yeah, and to be fair, expecting 100% accuracy from an AI is not sensible. You don't get 100% accuracy from humans. We just have the ability to review our own work and fix it. But doesn't AI also?
So
it's
just
a red herring almost.
So just a couple of comments on that. So I think first of all, like I totally agree about the data scientist part, and there's been a bunch of pieces, a flurry of content on this. Like I picked one from my friend Joe McKendrick over at ZDNet, is prompt engineer displacing data scientist as the sexiest job. Yeah. And I'm really getting fed up with this kind of crap. Now Joe did a good article on it. Joe's a really good writer and thoughtful. But in general, there's this whole thing around, we don't need data scientists anymore, and that's just really crap. I think but there is an emerging role for a kind of prompt engineer that can help users query the system and can also automate some of the most important things by embedding some of the prompts into the AI system as well. So there's a nice emerging role there, and I think one of the things that is cool is how users that maybe didn't have access, like Figma, we just published an article on Figma and how getting business users involved in design who don't have those skills, but who can type in some prompts on what they want to see. And, so I think there's some really cool things there. But the data scientist and the importance of someone who understands that domain is not going away. That's total bullshit. And I just don't just stop it with that. But the thing that I did want to say, though, is Dr. Wu was emphasizing what I call instant mediocrity, which is not a bad thing necessarily, which is that if machines can do something at scale 24/7 better than at least some of your human workers, then there is some value in those use cases. But I think you should still look a lot at what machines can do better than humans. And for example, the blog post example, I really hate that. The blog posts written by these bots, just crappy blogs. I'm sorry, they're just jargon-laden crap. But things like text to image, pretty amazing. And the ability to summarize. So for example, you have a white paper and you want to give me the top 5 bullet points from this. You can repurpose content in various forms. So to me, like looking at what machines are good at, they're really good, especially the multimodal versions of chat. They're really good at repurposing content in various formats. And so instead of saying, can this write a crappy blog? Nah, yeah, it can, but it can also do some stuff better than you, which is summarize, turn it into images, turn it into a slide deck. Like use it for things. This is what is frustrating me so much right now is like, you get creative about some of these use cases and don't just say, can it do something I can do? Maybe it can do something you can't do better than you. And I think that should really take a hard look at that. But on the other hand, a different thing on the blog post would be like job descriptions. I actually like the job descriptions use case a lot because job descriptions don't have to be like a really good piece of writing like a blog. They're just job descriptions, and Gen AI is great at that. And now my colleague Brian Summer hates the job descriptions use case. He thinks it's low value. He thinks it's like commodity stuff. But I would argue that enterprise is full of non-sexy use cases like this that actually are going to save people time. And when I talk to HR leaders and managers, they're excited about this use case because they don't like writing these job descriptions. And this is a great example of where quote unquote mediocrity, I guess you could say, is fine, because all you need is like the key factual elements of what it entails. And if that builds trust and confidence in the system, then great.
Yeah, I would argue that Brian has not read many job descriptions lately, nor has he ever had to write one. Because he's pretty ragged.
In Brian's defense, one of the points he makes that I like is that job descriptions that are really well done can be a form of competitive advantage. And I do understand that. And I don't think machines are going to be good at that type of job description. But let's face it, when you look at the typical job description, how many companies are really using them that way? They're just wasting HR administrators' time. And this is one of the big themes that I think Dr. Wu is getting at here, which is, why would you waste your time on mundane tasks when you can use AI to do those tasks and then free up your humans for more important stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah, but there, let me put a wrench into the job description part. I'm a bit on Brian's side there, because nearly no company that I know of, nearly no job description that I've ever read describes what they want. So, well, okay, then there's the efficiency point. Well, you can just crank it out a little faster, right? But that doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, cranking out bad work fast is...
Yeah, that doesn't solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely, I would say, ways for refinement, right? I think right now, it's very often is the case that these job descriptions are written, but not by the, I would say I mean, if I'm trying to hire a data scientist, right, the job description is not written by another data scientist. It's actually written by some HR person, who doesn't have the remote have any idea about what data scientists actually do, So I mean, so you go through these kind of almost kind of what do people write about, these type of role, these type of, and it's a little bit, I would say, just copy and kind of, even I would say bad copy and paste. You don't even know what you're copying is actually the right thing or the standard or whatever. Sometimes it's actually very bad, right? And so why not have data scientists write this job description? Well, because their time is valuable, right? I don't want my data scientists, spend another hour or something to writing a job description of what type of colleague or that you're trying to hire, right? But what if you can, reduce the time for your data scientists to write this job description? Normally you probably take them an hour. You want to spend an hour, but what if you take them only 5 minutes to validate, to read it or revise it, right? Then it may be okay, right? So this is the thing, right? I mean, now you can actually have people who are qualified to do the job to together with AI to do these things much faster. So that doesn't actually take that much time. So it doesn't actually, take, I would say, distract him from his main job or role, right, that he's supposed to do. And it would be much better job description, because now he knows what he's trying to look for. He's what kind of quality.
Two really quick points on that. First, like I think you always have to defer to customers, and I talk with a bunch of HR customers who said, I'm looking forward to this. This is going to make my life easier. I think that's important. But the second thing is, who says that because it's automatically generated that you can't also do some customizable stuff now that you don't have to do the nitty gritty of, this is required, this is required. Like, for example, what if the HR manager, instead of taking the time to write job descriptions, sought out video interviews from data scientists that they posted with the job description saying, here's what it's like to work for this company, or here's the kinds of skills that are successful, like value add kind of content that you never had time for before, that adds a human face to your HR department. The point is that when you save time on something, now the challenge is, what do you do with the time that you saved? And if you can do that value add stuff, that's really key. And the system can't do that for you, so you have to be smart about it, right? The system's going to help you save time. It's not going to do the value add stuff yet. But if you can do both, then I think you can start to transform how you work.
Chaka, there we go.
Let's get a little back from job descriptions as a use case. So we started off with kind of the prompt engineers, the new data scientists, which
not going to happen.
Which I'm not going to comment.
Yeah, that's crap.
I would
Sorry.
say that
maybe is the question there is shouldn't the system become the prompt engineer? I mean, if I just make my users prompt engineers, isn't that a bit off?
Well, I mean, usually you want someone who, I mean, because these prompts are just normal English, human language prompts, right? So anyone who has, who speak the language, actually any language, whether it's English or French or Spanish or whatever, can write this prompt, right? So you don't need to, the promise of these language model, right, is the fact that, now anyone can actually turn their English or whatever language or human language, right? You can turn human language into code, right? So to kind of executable code. Yeah, sure, they're executable, but it may not. How do you know that it actually is doing what you ask it to do, right? Because the problem with human language is that human language is very imprecise, right? I could say, very, very precise things, right? And it can still be interpreted, I would say, hundreds of different ways. Right? And how do you know that the machine actually interpreted the right way that you want, right? How do you know, let's say like I wanted to, an example that I often use in one of my lectures that, suppose I just wanted this language model to generate a query against my database. I wanted to know, let's say, the total margin lift of my French customers last quarter. Okay, so that's a very precise thing that I mentioned, right? I want I want total margin lift of my French customers last quarter. I have who, what, when, and I have all this stuff I want, right? But that could still be interpreted very differently by a machine, right? A machine would probably say, oh, when you say French customer, do you mean like only the customer inside the country France? Or do you mean all French-speaking customers? Or do you want to count the French colonies in there? Or, when you say last quarter, do you mean last calendar quarter? Do you mean fiscal quarter? Do you mean last 90 day? So all these are nuanced, right? I mean, you will generate the code, the SQL, and you will be executed against the database, and you will give you an answer back. And how do you know it's correct? You have no idea if it's correct. Check it. You ask some data scientist to write the query and check it. And then if you are going to ask the data scientist to check it, there's no point asking the language model, right?
So just real quick, I do think that prompt engineers can ease the load on data scientists by working with domain experts to help teach the domain experts how to properly query the systems themselves. And then the domain experts can teach their junior associates how to do the same thing and guide them. And so I think prompt engineers can be the glue between data scientists and domain experts, and I like that model for AI projects. I have two itches to scratch from our last conversation real quick. One is, in our last conversation, there was some bullshit at the end of the discussion, not really by anyone here, but in the audience, around how hallucination is a feature. I totally reject that. Like hallucination is a problem that needs to be dealt with. And I think there are some good progress being made using the techniques we described and other techniques to address this. Now, if hallucination was a feature, and I do agree that in some cases it's nice to get some creative results from the system for brainstorming and stuff, then that feature should be turned on and off. That's how you know it's a feature. It's a feature when you can turn it off. It's not a feature if you can't turn it off. I'm sorry. Hallucination is not a feature. That's crap. The second thing I wanted to get onto is the energy consumption issue, because these systems are not cheap to run, and this affects pricing. And one of the things we did not discuss is that the pricing models of this technology are continuing to evolve from vendors and stuff like that. And so when you're a customer, when you have to take ownership of these products and figure out by what metrics are you going to measure your success, because this is very important to getting further buy-in. And so energy consumption is a factor because it affects pricing. It's not the only factor. And I would point you to a recent piece in the MIT Technology Review that found in particular that generating AI images from text uses as much energy as charging your phone. There's some important research coming out on that. It's not just training the big models that costs money. And look, I think these are solvable problems. The fact that these tools are not cheap doesn't mean they're not going to be effective. I think they will be. But these are all things that customers have to take into account in terms of how is this going to be priced? Is this going to be consumption-based? What does the licensing look like? Different models. Box has a different model than Microsoft. You're going to have to evaluate that as part of your purchasing decisions for these systems. So those are the two things from our last conversation I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I have maybe, so the hallucination and pricing, right? So I think that I think I have comments on both of those as well. So I think like hallucination, yeah, I think in certain, application, like I said, you want the system to be creative, right? If I wanted to generate art work or something, or
like tagline brainstorming is a great one. Like getting taglines for like certain campaigns. That's an example where you actually want some of that.
Yeah.
And you should be able to like activate that into the system and say, give me that when I want it.
And I think you can. I think it's just not very popularly known. I think in the if you're data science, if you go to the back end of the GPT model, ChatGPT model, there's a temperature parameter that you can set. Typically, it's actually set to 0, right? So that means like, when it will always, in terms of the predicting the next word, you will always select the most probable word, right? When you actually crank that temperature up, you actually select, a distribution of words, not always. So it becomes much, much more creative that way. Okay. So in some way you can control it, right? So you, together with retrieval augmented generation and the tweaking of this temperature parameter, you could almost, I would say, reliably turn on and off this feature. So so that's one, what I have to say about hallucination. And I do think that in some applications, right, it can be treated as a feature. I think it's a good thing in some applications. Right?
Oh, for sure.
Creative applications, especially.
But yeah, it just is important. It's important to be able to turn it on and off. And I just wanted to point out that in the bigger systems, like there's still a problem there. If you use narrow focus approaches, then yes, you can reduce it. But it's something that the industry is still working on. Is the only point I wanted to make. And I just don't want people to be passive about it and say, oh, that's fine because it just helps us. It's like, no, the user should be able to decide exactly when they want that capability and when they don't. That's all.
Sure. About like pricing, right? I totally agree with you that I think it will be more and more of an issue in the future because I think these energy consumption, right? It's huge, and it's only a matter of time that there will be some kind of, I don't know, regulation or maybe even tax on like the carbon emission tax for airlines and stuff like that. And they will have no choice but to pass those costs to the end user, right? So we will have to pay for it. So I think for that, I would just say that like, use generative AI for what generative AI do best, right? And these are use cases that are, I would say, typically not pre-programmable and kind of scriptable, right? They're generative AI. You need something, you generate it right there and then, right at the moment, right? So it's not, you cannot kind of pre-program it or prescript it or something, right? Mm-hmm. So if you could, pre-script it or pre-program it, then you should just pre-program it, because that's a much cheaper way, right, to do it, right? And the only time that you should use generative AI is in those cases are basically you can't do it. You can't pre-program. For example, having a lively conversation with your audience, right? That's something you don't know what the audience is going to ask. You can't pre-program that. You just have to generate the sentence, one sentence at a time after another sentence, right? So that is, I would say, you have to use it for its generative nature, right? I mean, so that so think about, not every problem is best solved with generative AI, right? And I think that's what I would say to the pricing issue. Yeah. So.
Yep. Well said.
Yeah.
Mm.
Before we
indeed.
get too much further in, I should point out that we have reached the top of the hour, and
Oh,
that is very sad. It just flew by.
Yeah.
So we're already done, but I guess it is time for the famous last words. And I want to ask the both of you, and the rest of us, as long as we're here, what we think we're going to be talking about this time next year regarding AI.
Mm.
What do we think will have been resolved? What do we think will be the next problem on the horizon?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to be continuing to have a pretty similar conversation. Because these things, they advance, but the themes are going to be the same. It's going to be about bias and ethics and getting everything right in the design. And we didn't talk about bias and ethics much today, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But to me, these things are incredibly important, and they're way, way more important right now than the doomsday scenarios. So those are important to talk about too, for different reasons. But a lot of this is getting the design right and realizing that these tools are powerful, but they require very thoughtful implementation. And I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. But one thing I think we will have next year is we'll have a lot more interesting both success stories and failure stories to talk about. We're going to have a lot more live generative AI projects to talk about next year in a lot of different domains. That will be very interesting, so we can discuss the keys to successful projects. We're also going to see a lot of failed projects, and I hope we're going.
Oops.
Uh-oh, what's going on?
Goodness. I think the AI must have gotten a little bit nervous about what John was saying.
Yeah, that's scary.
Just got Skyneted.
Yeah. Well,
While John is coming back up, maybe I could say a couple of things. So I since John is focused on more the business side, I like to focus a little bit more on the academic side. I think there's actually a lot of very interesting progress on the science, academics, researchers, how they are using these or advancing this technology. Right. I think one is I think right now, even though this generative AI is so-called generative, in a sense that that they create, they supposedly create, right? But I mean, if you don't train it properly, right, or don't regularize it properly, they do, get into this problem of just plain memorization, right, which is bad, right? So, it's actually, it has this problem of oh, you're back. Sorry. So let me just finish what I was saying quickly. So I think I think one thing that we certainly would like to see, a lot of progress has been made about AI that can actually plan and reason. Okay, so this I think right now this generative AI right now is very much on one end of the spectrum, saying it's still kind of generating things, but it's generating things based on essentially patterns that you have seen before, like the language, how this particular language is being used previously by other people in all the sources that you have seen, right? So it's almost a little bit like kind of almost like just like I'm reading all the stuff out there and I'm just trying to re-synthesize them, right? Whereas when you have reasoning and planning, then you can be truly more creative in that way. So that's why I like to say hopefully we'll talk about that next year.
Now that John is back from his Skynet incident.
Yeah, finish what you were saying.
Yeah, and just real quick, I agree with the planning and reasoning, though I think that's going to take longer than a year, and we could have a whole different hour discussion on some of the really interesting developments and the debates around the future of AI. But we know that it's going to take more than just scale and throwing more parameters of data at these systems. And the exciting thing about the enterprise is that there's an opportunity to be more focused and try different techniques. So I really like that about the enterprise. But yeah, I was saying before I disappeared that I'm really excited about the protein folding breakthroughs by AlphaFold, because this is really showing what machines can do best, is documenting 200 million proteins and all these breakthroughs in medical advances that are possible because of things like this. And to me, that's the really exciting stuff, is when we see advances that could be like life-changing. And I never want to lose that curiosity, because I know I call BS on a lot of things, but I think there's also some really exciting things, and let's see how those play out.
Yeah, keep in mind that requires a very good data source, right? People have to spend time to document what all the existing protein, what they do, what the active site is, and what the binding affinity for all that stuff, right? So once you have that very good data source, then generative AI could do amazing things. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it sounds to me like we're going to have to do a round 3.
All right.
Gee, what a shame. No, it's something I absolutely look forward to. But closing off for today, Jon Reed, Dr. Michael Wu, thank you both very much for your time and your insight. You're wonderful guests individually, and when we put you together, it's just that much better. So thanks for that.
Although Brent was missing the blood.
Sorry, Brent. We can't disagree for theater.
Maybe we'll have a good slobber knocker next time.
We apologize for not serving vampires this episode. Too bad.
I'm not a vampire, so I'm not hungry for blood.
All right, so our audience should tune in next week, if you like, when we're going to dive into selecting a CRM system that works for you with our guest, Kristen Rosenoff. It should be a nice change of topic, and we hope to see you then.
Okay, bye.
Catch you later.
Cheers.
Take care and join us.